the number one problem is, at a very fundamental level, the word science is constantly used in a way that is without definition and is without clarification.
Hello everybody, I want to welcome you again to another edition of the Uncensored Pilgrims. I am Marty McLain along with the irrepressible and today the professorial.
Wow, professorial, I'll take that.
Looked at the pronunciation.
Okay, thank you. Paul Price, that's me.
Paul Price. And today what we're going to do, Paul gave a talk earlier this week. Oh, why don't you tell them what you gave the talk on, Paul?
Yeah, so I, as I mentioned, I went on to the Standing for Truth YouTube channel with Donnie. Highly recommend that channel, and he has been so gracious as to host me several times. He's actually turned it into a playlist where you can go and see my appearances at that channel, giving various debates and talks. And this past Monday evening, I did a presentation that I called The Malcolm Effect, but it was on the difference between historical science and operational science. And I talked on this because, number one, it's an important key to understand the whole creation-evolution debate in the proper context. And number two, because it really gets under the skin of the evolutionists when you bring this out. They don't want people to understand this.
That's the irrepressible side of it.
Yes, but I'm so irrepressible they couldn't hold it back.
Could not.
And I went out there and I spilled the beans for everyone to see the difference between historical science and operational science, and why both creation and evolution are examples of historical science. When we're talking about going and looking up, trying to look for clues for things that have happened in the past, that's different than if we're doing repeatable experiments on things like gravity or electricity, things that we can really see in the world around us as laws, natural laws, the way things operate in nature. So there is a fundamental distinction, and I think you'll enjoy what we're about to show you here. Now, this isn't the actual broadcast that we did on Monday, but instead this is a recording I made on my own just to kind of prep for that, and it's basically just me giving the presentation and recording my screen on the PowerPoint presentation so you can see what I'm presenting. But I do recommend that you watch it, and I also recommend you check out the discussion that occurred after. If you go and you check it out on the Standing for Truth channel, you'll get to also hear the open mic that we had afterward, and had some very interesting back and forth with some scientists who called in and tried to take me on. So
that was not wise, was it?
So, but yeah, we did want to present this here for everybody on the Uncensored Pilgrims podcast to get to hear the difference between operational and historical science.
Okay, without further ado, here is the talk from Paul Price.
Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me tonight, where I'm going to be presenting what I call the Malcolm Effect: historical science, operational science, and the sliding scale of trust. And this topic is so important because I frequently, obviously as many of you are aware, I'm frequently involved in quite a few online debates and discussions surrounding creation science, as somebody who has written over 60 articles on creation science for mainly creation.com, but also answersingenesis.org, and had many debates and conversations with atheists and the like. And the number one problem is, at a very fundamental level, the word science is constantly used in a way that is without definition and is without clarification. So the first step in this process is I wanted to start with getting a good, perhaps universally agreeable definition of science coming from a we'll just say non-ultra biased perspective, and that is going to be the Encyclopedia Britannica. They define science as any system of knowledge that is concerned with the physical world and its phenomena, and that entails unbiased observations. And notice that I have bolded some important phrases here. Unbiased observations and systematic experimentation. In general, a science involves a pursuit of knowledge covering general truths or the operations of fundamental laws. Now, I would submit to you that at the base of this definition is really what I'm calling operational science. And I say that because operational science is that type of science which is open to repeatable, systematic experimentation, and it deals with the operation of fundamental laws of nature. And I'm sure many of you have many times seen this little chart, probably in your middle school and high school science textbooks. And this is what we call the scientific method. And I put a star down there at the bottom where it says test with experiment. Testing is really at the base of operational, or also sometimes called experimental, science. In fact, many people would say if it's not testable and if it's not repeatable, it's not science at all. And what is, many of you might know this already, but what is the type of reasoning that we're using here? This is inductive reasoning, where we reason from a part or from an individual experience to a general or a universal truth that we're trying to arrive at through looking at repetitive individual facts and experiences. And another thing that might be important to note here on inductive reasoning is that this only works with the assumption of the uniformity of nature, which is simply put that the future is going to be like the past. As Christians, we have a basis for this assumption in the reasonable and non-capricious nature of our God, who upholds the universe. Atheists, on the other hand, have no basis for their assumption of uniformity. They just simply take it as a brute fact and move from there. Now, history is very different from operational science. We can also call this historical science because we're talking about perhaps a mixed discipline where we're using the tools of operational science, but we're really doing history using those tools as opposed to operational science. And it differs by lacking two of the key features that make up the definition of operational science. Number one, historical events are not repeatable. And number two, historical events are not falsifiable. Now, falsification, that really, if we go back a couple steps, if you look at the bottom there where it says test with experiment, what we're really trying to do there is we're trying to falsify the hypothesis in the previous step of the scientific method there. No experiment can prove your hypothesis true because you can imagine that there are ways that your hypothesis could be false, and yet you could still get an experimental result that is consistent with your hypothesis. You might call that a false positive, for example. But one thing you cannot get is a false negative, and that's due to just pure deductive logic. If you can identify a possible result that is not, under any circumstances, compatible with your hypothesis, then if you do a test and you get that result, we say that you have falsified your hypothesis. So that's what we're trying to do there with testing. We're trying to falsify. And you can't do that with history. That's why in history we're using what we call abductive reasoning rather than inductive reasoning. We're not trying to infer a general truth from an individual piece of information. What we're instead trying to do is infer a past historical event. We're trying to arrive at an inference to the best explanation for a set of facts. And we call that abductive reasoning. But this is what I was talking about with regards to falsification. No matter the finding from the field, even if it's an unexpected finding, none of it could ever conclusively prove that a past historical event didn't happen. And for that reason, we say that history cannot be falsified. If something cannot be falsified, does it really deserve to be called science? And I would say, no, it doesn't. Or certainly it doesn't deserve to be called science in an unqualified way. I would call it historical science, maybe. Let's use an example of a crime scene investigation. So what if you don't find any fingerprints at the crime scene? Does that falsify your crime? No. The suspect could have worn gloves. What if you don't find a murder weapon? Does that falsify? No. Could have disposed of the murder weapon. What if you don't find a body? Does that falsify? No. The body also could have been disposed of. So this is the example I'm just trying to give to show that findings from the field, by just in a theoretical way, they cannot falsify a hypothesis in history. You could always come up with some type of a workaround or an alternate theory that explains why you didn't find what you expected to find. Now, I'm going to now quote from Dr. Henry G., a British paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. And this actually came from the writing of Carol Cleland, who we're going to get to in a moment. She is the person who originally quoted this, but this is an important quote for our discussion here. He says that historical hypotheses can never be tested by experiment, and so they are unscientific. No science can ever be historical. And it's ironic that an evolutionary biologist would say that. I'm not sure if he would recognize the damage that does to his own discipline of evolutionary biology, given that we cannot observe past claims about historical evolutionary events. So not sure if he would understand that or not, but nonetheless, this is a quote from him. No science can ever be historical. Now, Dr. Carol Cleland is a well-known philosopher of science who's taking up the challenge here to try to defend historical science against these types of statements. And so she disagrees with Dr. G. She says, and for some reason she calls it historiographic science. I guess that sounds a little bit more impressive than just saying historical science. But in any case, she says, historiographic science differs in important ways from experimental science, and by that she means operational science. The hypotheses of experimental science typically postulate regularities among kinds or types of events. In contrast, the hypotheses of scientific historiography typically postulate particular events. Now, this is an important quote because one thing that as a creationist you're going to hear time and time again from evolutionists is that this distinction that we make between operational science and historical science is entirely incorrect, entirely inappropriate, and entirely made up purely by creationists for self-serving reasons. But here you can see that's clearly not the case. Dr. Cleland is, again, an established philosopher of science and an evolutionist. And here she is in 2011 very clearly explaining this operational versus historical distinction that we're making here. And she means by it exactly the same thing that creationists mean by it. Operational science is about regularities, and historical science is about particular past events, historical events. Now, what she attempts to argue in her work is that historical and operational science are equal in terms of reliability. She's trying to rescue historical science from the types of attacks that we creationists are making against it. And she mainly does this not by attempting to strengthen the case for historical science. Surprisingly, but she rather does it by attacking the objectivity of empirical science and trying to knock it down a peg to where it is on par with the rather subjective historical science discipline. She argues that scientists are able to do tests in the realm of history by searching for smoking gun evidence in the field. And this supposedly overcomes the problem of historical science lacking objectivity. The problem with that is, though, that for any given set of available clues, there is an infinite number of conceivable ways to explain how those clues came to be. This means that inevitably, personal biases will come into play when constructing stories about the evidence. Cleland writes, "A smoking gun is a trace that picks out one of the competing hypotheses as providing a better causal explanation for the currently available traces than the others." Now, pay attention here. We've got some subjective words here. Better. That's subjective because who gets to decide what is better? And currently available, there's a degree of, you might say, subjectivity in, well, who decides what evidence we are going to look at and what evidence we're not going to look at? And who decides whether the evidence that we're looking at is complete enough to give us an accurate picture of what happened? There's so much room for subjectivity in here. And that's why I don't believe that historical science should be viewed on the same level as operational science. Now, 10 years later, so that quote came from 2001. 10 years later, in 2011, she wrote a little bit more soberly on this topic. She said, "Even supposing that the correct explanation is among those under consideration, there are no guarantees that a smoking gun for it will be found, even supposing that one exists." Well, Dr. Cleland, that doesn't sound very hopeful to me. That sounds pretty pessimistic as it regards historical science. So, but she is actually leaving out the biggest problem of all. Even if a smoking gun is found, there is no guarantee it will be accepted as such or interpreted correctly. And I'm going to give you an important case in point here. Unpermineralized, or also we could just say unfossilized, dinosaur bones and soft tissue finds are smoking gun evidence that dinos are not millions of years old. And I wrote on this several years back. You can check that link there at creation.com. That picture there is one of the bones that was found. I'm not sure that that particular bone was unpermineralized or not. It'd be hard to tell just from a black and white photograph, but I did some research and I published in the Journal of Creation on the lifespan of bone, just bone as a substance. How long could it last? And the most conservative estimate I found would be that it could last up to 700,000 years at 10 degrees Celsius. Now that's a conservative estimate. An actual calculation was done much more recently by Dr. Brian Thomas for his PhD dissertation. He did original research on the half-life of various biomolecules, including bone collagen. And he found that at 7.5 degrees Celsius, the half-life of bone collagen is 1,678 years. Now, that would definitely imply a real upper limit of under 10,000 years for any surviving bone material. Yet, the Liscum bone bed from which the unpermineralized hadrosaur bones were taken has been dated radiometrically to approximately 70 million years old. It can't be. Bones cannot last nearly that long. They are blatantly cherry-picking the data and ignoring contrary evidence. Now, I argue that we should approach historical science as a sliding scale of trust, with claims made about recent events being more trustworthy than claims made about events in the remote past. And this is why, for example, that we can consider forensic studies in crime scenes to be legitimate historical science while rejecting the lofty claims to knowledge made by scientists talking about events supposedly happening millions of years ago. Historical science is generally less trustworthy than operational science overall for three main reasons. One, reconstructions of past events are limited by our experience, our imagination, and, perhaps most importantly, our personal biases. Number two, evidence is lost over time. And lastly, chaos theory. I'm looking forward to talking about that one. We're going to get into that one last. Here's an example that I came up with just for talking about bias in interpretation. Now, this is not an extinct animal skull, but let's just pretend for a moment that it is an extinct animal skull. We've just found it in the field. Nobody's ever seen this before. What do you imagine, just looking at this skull, what does it look like to you? And if you were a scientist trying to interpret this skull, how would you perhaps interpret this? Would this be a meat eater, a plant eater, or maybe an omnivore? Now, just speaking for myself, to me this has a lot of the hallmarks of looking like a dog skull. Now, obviously, we can't tell the size of it from this photograph that doesn't have any context. But just looking at it, the shape of it looks like a dog. It's got canine-looking teeth, long, sharp teeth in the front there that look like they could rip and tear meat. And even the back teeth, they start to flatten out a bit, implying maybe this could be some type of omnivore, perhaps, or it could just be a carnivore. I certainly wouldn't guess that it was what it actually is, which is this, a fruit bat. It's a fruit bat. So now, why do I bring this example up? It's just to show that when all you have is evidence from the field, evidence doesn't speak for itself. Field finds like this don't come with a built-in interpretation and a built-in explanation. Scientists have to come up with stories about it, and based on your assumptions that you make, you could be wildly off base. And since history is not repeatable, there's no real way to know just how off base you might be. Talking about number two, evidence being lost. One study concluded that cold cases, those are old, unsolved criminal cases, they are solved using physical evidence only about 13% of the time. That would be forensic science, or also known as historical science. Eyewitness testimony, on the other hand, resulted in a closed case 63% of the time. Now, why do you think that might be? Well, I would say probably because evidence is being lost over time. If there wasn't enough evidence to convict earlier on, why in the world would there suddenly be enough evidence to convict much later on? Really, the only time that might happen is if new discoveries happen later on, but that's very rare. Most of the time, evidence is obscured and lost rather than gained over time. Here's another example of evidence being lost. Arches National Park has over 2,000 rock arches. 43 collapsed between 1977 and 2015, according to park rangers. That gives us a rate of collapse of about 1 per year, allowing that vandals might have destroyed a small number, although I don't even know why we need to consider that separately, because when have there not been vandals around? But such an attrition rate would mean that all of them would be gone in about 2,000 years at the prevailing rates of erosion from wind and rain. Now, obviously, these rock arches are not forming at a rate of 1 per year. So this is actually kind of a double whammy piece of evidence, because number one, it's showing us how quickly we're losing evidence. But number two, this shows us that rock arches are not, forming today. They can't be because they're collapsing far too quickly. So they would definitely be an example of evidence of a worldwide one-time global flood in the past, rather than being interpretable in a uniformitarian way. So this is a really cool piece of evidence. It shows us, number one, we're losing information about the past over time. Imagine, let's go back in time, closer and closer to Noah's flood. Imagine how much more obvious it was closer to the event. I mean, I still think it's pretty obvious that there was a global flood, but imagine how much more obvious it was thousands of years ago. We've lost so much. We're losing on average one of these rock arches per year. What other geological features that point to Noah's flood have already been lost, obscuring our picture of the past? The further away you get from an event, the fewer physical clues we will have. And now lastly, let's tackle this interesting topic of chaos theory. And this definition of chaos theory I got from fractalfoundation.org. Because we can never know all of the initial conditions of a complex system in sufficient detail, and by sufficient they mean perfect, we cannot hope to predict the ultimate fate of a complex system. Even slight errors in measuring the state of a system will be amplified dramatically, rendering any prediction useless. Since it is impossible to measure the effects of all the butterflies in the world, for example, accurate long-range weather prediction will always remain impossible. Now, that came from Fractal Foundation. What I'm about to read to you now actually comes from the book Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. And the character speaking these lines is the guy you see up top from the movie, the wonderful Jeff Goldblum, playing the character of Ian Malcolm. Now, Ian Malcolm says, chaos theory says two things. First, that complex systems like weather have an underlying order. And second, that reverse of that simple systems can produce complex behavior. For example, pool balls. You hit a pool ball and it starts to carom off the sides of the table. In theory, that's a fairly simple system, almost a Newtonian system. Since you can know the force imparted to the ball and the mass of the ball, and you can calculate the angles at which it will strike the walls, you can predict the future behavior of the ball. In theory, you could predict the behavior of the ball far into the future as it keeps bouncing from side to side. You could predict where it will end up 3 hours from now, in theory. But in fact, it turns out you can't predict more than a few seconds into the future, because almost immediately very small effects, imperfections in the surface of the ball, tiny indentations in the wood of the table, start to make a difference. And it doesn't take long before they overpower your careful calculations. So it turns out that this simple system of a pool ball on a table has unpredictable behavior. Now, in case you think that Crichton was just making this up for his fiction book Jurassic Park, I'm going to quote from a more recent story that I found. In 1978, a physicist, Michael Berry, calculated the number of collisions a billiard ball can make before a player has no way of knowing its eventual trajectory. It turned out that such calculations require taking into account not just mechanical forces, but the gravity of Earth and the gravitational pull of objects close to the table. Berry estimated that if that object, for instance, is a person who weighs 50 kilos, the determinacy would be lost after 9 collisions, or even before if not considering the gravity impact. So if using physics to predict the future gets exponentially harder as you move further away from the present moment, the same would obviously be true of the past. And this simple fact dooms all attempts to use so-called dating methods over alleged deep time. We cannot even predict the motion of billiard balls past a handful of collisions. How are we possibly going to accurately interpret the results of radioactive decay in rocks spanning over millions of years of unknown history? Can anybody say hubris? The moral of the story of Jurassic Park is simply this: people overestimate how much control they have over nature, and this is partly because they overestimate their own level of understanding. In other words, we need to approach the world with a much greater sense of humility. And what does humility in science look like, you may ask? Well, here's what I think humility in science looks like. 1, not extrapolating far beyond your data. That would be a good start, wouldn't it? 2, not cherry-picking your data. 3, not using the word science in an unqualified and misleading way. 4, not making appeals to authority, fallacious or otherwise. You know, this is something that really gets under my skin. People like to say, well, making an appeal to authority is not always a fallacy. It can just be an inductive argument. It can just be a probabilistic argument. Well, you know, most experts in X, Y, or Z field believe A, B, or C, and so therefore, since they are the experts, A, B, and C are more likely to be true just based on that fact alone. Well, that might be technically a correct argument, but it's a very weak argument, and I think it's a very arrogant argument for anyone to make. I think humility demands that we get rid of all appeals to authority. Stop telling people to believe something because somebody with a degree said it, and let's just talk about the evidence and the arguments and the logic. Recognizing the practical limits of science. This is such a big one. And one of the ways that we recognize that is by understanding the difference between operational science and historical science. And then lastly, recognizing that there are other sources of truth besides science. This is what got us into so much trouble as a human race, starting in the Enlightenment period. These arrogant gentlemen decided to stop paying attention to any source of truth other than themselves and their own minds. And they discarded the most important thing that God has ever given us, which is the Scriptures. And that was an act of extreme arrogance and hubris. Science is not our only way to know things. So for more on this topic, I do suggest these 2 articles that you see here, both of which I wrote. But of course, if you read them and you check the footnotes and the citations, I do cite sources. It's not based on my own knowledge. Now, lastly, I'm going to leave you as an appendix to this presentation. I'm going to talk about the evidences favoring a young Earth, comparing that with the evidences favoring an old Earth. And I would argue that the evidences favoring a young Earth are really overwhelming. And I'm going to start in both cases with the most important thing. The most important item on the list comes first. And that is the first point here in favor of a young Earth is the Bible teaches it. That should be enough for anybody because the Bible has really passed every test we could throw at it. It is the Word of God, and it proves it in so many ways. Probably the most striking of these ways is the strikingly fulfilled prophecies that we find in the Bible. But since the Bible passes the test, it is the Word of God, the fact that it teaches a young Earth would really be all we need, and it certainly is way more convincing than any of these attempts by scientists to come up with stories about the past. But let's move on from there. Let's start looking at some historical science, which is based on observable evidence. Soft tissue, unpermineralized bone found in ancient strata. Quickly crumbling geological features, like rock arches. Ocean salinity accumulating too quickly. The ocean is getting too salty too quickly. Ocean nickel concentrations are insufficient for old ages. Now, keep in mind, these evidences that I'm listing out here are based on extrapolation, which is the very thing that the old Earth scientists are doing when they try to tell us they have evidence for the Earth being old. So we can use their tool against them. Extrapolation does not always support an old Earth. In fact, I would say most extrapolation that's available to us shows a much younger Earth. But they, like I said, unfortunately cherry-pick the evidence. Insufficient seafloor sediment for long ages. There's just not enough, there's too much sediment. Sediment is accumulating too quickly for us to find as little as we find, if it's an old Earth. And lastly, too much helium found in rocks, not enough helium found in the atmosphere. This is an interesting one, something that Dr. Russell Humphreys has written quite a bit about. Here are some places where you can go to check out these statements here for yourself. And I don't just recommend that you check these articles, I recommend you check the sources that are cited in these articles. Now, that was the overwhelming evidence for a young Earth. Let's move to the underwhelming evidence for an old Earth. And the most important evidence, so to speak, for an old Earth is that evolution absolutely requires it. That's why, long before radiometric dating methods were ever discovered, evolutionists, and specifically a small group of men in what they called the Lunar Society in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the 1700s, men like James Hutton and Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. These men had a deist worldview. Why they were deists, I would love to know. I would love to know what the contributing factors were that caused them to reject the faith that they were raised to have and instead become deists. That would be an interesting historical research, but the fact is that history may simply not exist. I've done a little bit of reading about James Hutton, for example. It seems that a lot of people just can't figure out where he got his ideas as far as why he suddenly decided that the earth must be old and why he rejected the Bible. All the history I read about Hutton, it just states as a matter of fact that he was a deist, but it never really explains why he rejected the Bible. It's clear that he did. But this is the most important thing right here. Evolution requires an old earth. That's why no matter what piece of evidence that you place in front of an evolutionist, no matter how much of a smoking gun it may be, they're never going to question an old earth because they have to have it. If you get rid of an old earth, evolution is dead in the water. No way it could possibly happen with a young earth. Now, I would argue it still can't happen with an old earth, but that's another whole argument. Radiometric dating. It shows too much daughter isotope in the rocks for a young earth. Why do we find so much daughter isotope when we think we can at least measure with, obviously they would say a high degree of specificity, the currently existing rates of radiometric decay from the parent isotope to the daughter isotope, we do find more daughter isotope in the rocks than we would expect based on the assumptions of starting out with no daughter isotope and an unchanged rate of radiometric decay and a closed system. Unfortunately for the old earthers, those are all rather large assumptions to make. And then lastly, distant starlight. How did it get here? That's a big question. Why can we see the light that seemingly, if we understand light correctly, seemingly should take millions of years to reach us and be visible to us? Why can we see these distant stars? A very interesting question, And it's a question that many creationists have tackled in various, really very different ways. There's not a single consensus on how to tackle that question. It is an open question, and it's an interesting conundrum for a biblical worldview. Here are some places I would suggest that you can go to read more about these items here. The first one, accelerated nuclear decay. There's evidence in the past, there's evidence that in the past there may have been periods of accelerated nuclear decay. That could explain why we find more daughter element. However, it does raise additional questions like, wouldn't that have created quite a bit of excess heat? And that is another conundrum, another question that is an open question and an interesting question indeed. And then the last thing on the list there is not by a creationist at all. It's Veritasium on YouTube. And it's why no one has measured the speed of light. And I really encourage everybody to watch this, because this is something that Dr. Jason Lisle has brought up quite a bit in his response to the distant starlight problem. But this is an interesting video that backs him up from a person and from a perspective that is not a creationist perspective. But it is very interesting to note that measuring the speed of light has never been done in a purely objective way. We can measure it in a round trip speed, but we cannot measure it on a one-way trip. And so that requires us to assume, if we believe that we can really measure the speed of light, we then have to assume that light travels at the same speed in all directions throughout the universe. And that really is an assumption that may or may not be justified. And so that's an interesting point as a sort of defeater to the claim that there's no way that the Earth could be young because of distant starlight. Well, the truth is we really don't know that much about light. It is mysterious to us, and we can't directly measure the one-way speed of light. And so it's entirely possible that we are using wrong assumptions to create that conundrum for ourselves there. So highly recommend that video. And with that, I'm going to finish this presentation and look forward to now opening it up to questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
And we need to let you know that the views that we express on this podcast belong to Marty McLain and Paul Price. They are our views. They do not reflect the views of anyone else. And with that said, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.